count of 4.
No.
3,
2.
1.
No.
Ascension. Ascension.
Just stay calm.
5,000 feet. 10,000 feet. 15,000 feet. Hallelujah.
This is Columbia, a place filled with technical wonders to explore. This time we're focusing on the science behind the Lutece Field, a field that can suspend an entire city in air. And if that wasn't enough, it also makes it possible to create pathways to other dimensions, or tears as we know them. Now, interdimensional travels and city levitation seems like two vastly different things. How could they possibly be connected? Well, I'm going to try and convince you that it does in fact make sense, at least from a quantum physics perspective. In the world of quantum physics, stuff doesn't necessarily make sense to us, which is what makes this place so exciting. The stuff that happens here is not necessarily stranger than what happens in classical mechanics, which is what we're used to, but humans haven't had any evolutionary benefits of comprehending quantum physics, so we don't. We instinctively try to apply the concept of classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, because those are the concepts our brains can grasp. And when you find out that things behave vastly different than your intuition tells you, you're in for quite a mind-blowing experience. So throw your intuitions and common sense away and let us dive deep into the world of quantum physics. Let's start by examining the tears and how they were discovered. Rosalind Lutece was observing an atom suspended in a Lutece field, when she noticed that she was not the only one observing this atom. Someone else was manipulating the same atom from another dimension. And so, by turning the Lutece field on and off, she was able to communicate with the person in the other dimension using Morse code. Transdimensional communication was established. The two of them then managed to expand on this technology, building the Lutece device, a device that made it possible to create portals, or tears, through which one can observe and even enter other dimensions. So, how is this interdimensional travel possible? We have to abide by the laws of physics, at least for the dimension we know, the one we're in, and it does seem like we are indeed violating one of these laws. The law of conservation of energy, which states that the total energy in an isolated system, such as a dimension, will remain constant. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Now, you could argue that our dimension is not an isolated system and that energy can move freely across dimensions, but as far as we know today, our scientific models hold true for this dimension. For simplicity, we're going to view mass as energy according to Einstein's mass-energy equivalence. So, let's say someone would visit us from another dimension, then they would increase the total amount of energy in this dimension, effectively creating energy, seen from our dimension. And we cannot create energy, but we can actually borrow energy. So we can actually get energy from nothing, as long as we pay it back. This can be observed when studying how objects behave when all external forces are nullified. The first successful experiment was conducted by placing two extremely thin metal plates close to each other. They were placed in a vacuum to remove any energy contribution from surrounding particles. They were made extremely lightweight to practically eliminate the contribution from gravity. They were grounded to eliminate any electrical forces. And with all these external forces eliminated, they were still pushed towards each other. This is known as the Casimir Effect, and what we're witnessing is negative energy. Classical mechanics tells us that energy needs to be positive, but quantum physics tells us that this is not the case. British physicist Paul Dirac proposed that negative energy is present all around us, but we don't experience it as it is cancelled out by the positive energy. If we have a confinement where all positive energy is removed, the negative energy is no longer cancelled out, which means that it can manifest and affect the objects around it, such as the metal plates. The theory is that there is an infinite amount of virtual particles in a certain space, that could either be present or not. Even though the space is empty, there is still a certain statistical probability that a certain particle is present. In practical terms, it could be thought of as particles randomly popping in and out of existence. These virtual particles comprise a Dirac sea, as it's called. The force created by the Dirac sea on either side of the metal plates pushes them towards each other. If the distance between them is small enough, it will overpower the force of any Dirac sea between them, pushing them together. Now, before we continue, let's take a quick look at the history of quantum physics to make sure that these theories at least somewhat coincides with the state of quantum science of that time period. We know that Lutece had managed to successfully suspend atoms in the Lutece field by 1893, when the city of Columbia ascended. The same year as the Lutece device capable of opening tears to other dimensions was finalized. The field of quantum theory has its roots in the early 19th century, sometimes referred to as the old quantum theories. This is where several scientists realized that not everything can be explained with classical mechanics, but it is at the turn of the 20th century where things really started to take off. 1893 was right in the beginning of a golden age of quantum physics. So, monumental discoveries, such as the Lutece field, make sense for this time period. But when it comes to the concept of negative energy, Lutece seems to have beaten other scientists to it with quite a large margin. The concept of negative energy was first suggested by Dirac in 1928, and the Casimir experiment was suggested by Dutch physicist Hendrik Casimir in 1948. With that said, I don't think Dirac's and Casimir's discoveries were crucial in the development of the Lutece field. I think a much earlier discovery were significantly more important, but we'll get back to that. Okay, so we know that negative energy exists, and viewed from our dimension, it appears from nothing and then it returns to nothing. So, this flow of energy to and from our dimension occurs all around us, all the time. Now, it doesn't seem that far-fetched to imagine another world at the other end of this energy transfer, or even multiple worlds, perhaps countless dimensions in energetic equilibrium, with some occasional temporary spillover. But in order for these theories to be useful in the pursuit of interdimensional travel, it has to be possible to control these phenomena. And that is what the Lutece field does. It makes it possible to control the energy transfer between a Lutece field in this dimension and what we assume to be another dimension. Then it's just a matter of making sure that the energy transfer between dimensions matches the energy of whatever we want to transfer. As an example, if you want to throw a 100-gram apple into a tear, you would have to crank up the energy transfer to approximately 9 petajoule, which is roughly the amount of energy that the entire globe consumes in 10 minutes. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the Lutece field needs to provide that amount of energy. The two dimensions will still be in energetic equilibrium. The energy you lose throwing the apple into the tear will be returned eventually, in one form or another. Now, we can't control exactly when negative energy appears, since we are dealing with probability, but we can tamper with this probability. And if we increase the probability enough in a certain confined space, we can start to make statistical assumptions with high accuracy. Now, that might seem a bit scary as we are in fact sending people through these tears, but more or less everything we do has a certain probability of catastrophic failure. But let's analyze what would happen if the calibration was off. If the energy transfer is too low, part of you would not be completely transferred. If it is way too low, whole parts of your body could be missing when you arrive. But if it's just a tiny bit too low, only a tiny bit of you would be left behind. This would probably appear as microscopic defects on a cellular level. Quite similar to the damage caused by radiation, I would imagine. So, just as with radiation, low doses should not be dangerous, but constant exposure probably is. Let's see how this theory matches the symptoms of someone we can assume have gotten more than a recommended dose. The prophet himself, Father Comstock. He suffers from fatal cancer and sterility, both of which are common symptoms for overexposure to radiation. If the energy transfer is too high, it gets a bit more complicated. Slightly more matter being transferred to another dimension should not be a problem in itself, but if the amount of energy to be transferred is greater than the amount of energy present in the Lutece field, the system is set out of balance, which I assume is crucial to avoid. Now, in order to understand what the Lutece field actually does, we need to know what environmental parameters are affecting the occurrence of negative energy. The parameter that sets the limit for the amount of energy that can be borrowed is entanglement entropy. Entanglement entropy is a quantity that describes the amount of quantum entanglement in a system. And quantum entanglement is when the quantum states of two or more quantum systems cannot be described independently of each other. If the quantum states of a set of systems can only be described together, the systems are entangled. So, here comes the big question: can you create quantum entanglement? Yes, you can. There are in fact numerous ways to do this. You can do it with spontaneous parametric downconversion, by using the Hong-Ou-Mandel effect, through entanglement swapping, just to mention a few. Now, analyzing what method Lutece used in the Lutece device is something you could probably easily spend a lifetime on. The probably most likely scenario is that Lutece found a method vastly more efficient than the ones we currently know, a method that was lost with Columbia and has not yet been rediscovered. Okay, so now we have a theory on how the Lutece field works, but we still have a few phenomena left to explain. Why do we see tears showing up all over Columbia every now and then? And how can it be that Elizabeth has at least some control over them? The first question is probably the easiest to answer. These tears probably appear due to energy imbalance between dimensions. Like the example we mentioned earlier, if the energy transfer between dimensions exceeds the energy present in the Lutece field, the depth still needs to be repaid somehow. And that is probably done through these seemingly spontaneous tears scattered across the city, consuming any excess energy. Now, why Elizabeth has control over them is a bit harder to explain with a solid connection to known science. She allegedly gains this ability when her pinky is severed by a closing tear, effectively scattering her across dimensions. And we can assume that this gave rise to quite a significant imbalance between the two dimensions, given that an entire body part was left behind. It is not unlikely that some of the remaining particles that make up Elizabeth's person are entangled with some of the particles in her lost pinky, which makes her a part of this imbalance. Now, as I said, how physics such as quantum entanglement works across dimensions is not something I can link to known science, so this part is going to be a bit speculative. Okay, so how big is this imbalance? Let's go back to Einstein's formula again. Let's estimate that the severed finger weighed around 10 grams. This would give us an energy imbalance of about 0.9 petajoule, about 1 minute of the global energy consumption. Now, if we're allowed to speculate a bit, you could imagine that such a significant imbalance could take quite some time to settle, possibly with some ringing, so to say, where energy is going back and forth between dimensions before equilibrium is obtained again. And since Elizabeth is part of this imbalance, what she does can affect when and where these energy transfers take place. Okay, so this theory seems to cover many of the phenomena we are witnessing in Columbia. Now let's revisit the history of quantum physics to see if the theory still fits the time period. As stated before, the existence of negative energy was not known until much later, and quantum entanglement was not discussed until the mid-1930s. But the concept I believe to be more important in the development of the Lutece field is the concept of entropy, which was well established by the fourth quarter of the 19th century. Now, entropy is not an easy concept to describe in just a few words, but one of the ways it is used is to describe the behavior of microscopic particles with statistics, which is what I believe to be of importance to the story. Many discoveries in quantum physics started out as observations, and then later explained by mathematical models. We cannot be certain that Lutece completely understood the physics behind quantum entanglement, but at least we know she had a way to quantify it. Okay, so we have one big question left to answer. How does the Lutece field, aside from allowing transdimensional travel, also allow cities to float? Well, now that we know the physics behind the Lutece field, it is actually quite simple to explain. Let's go back to the Einstein equivalence theorem once more. Now we know about negative energy, and we know that the Lutece field increases the presence of negative energy. So let's see what happens if we introduce negative energy to the formula. Now we have a negative value on the left, and in order for the equal sign to hold true, we need a negative value on the right as well. C is the speed of light, a real positive constant, so the mass needs to be negative. Negative energy relates to negative mass. Now, what desirable features does negative mass have? Let's take a look at the formula for universal gravitation. G is the gravitational constant, m1 and m2 are the masses of two objects, and r is the distance between the center of mass of these two objects. This gives us the gravitational force with which these two objects are pulled towards each other. So let's say that m1 is Earth and m2 is Columbia. Then we get the force with which Columbia is pulled towards Earth. Now let's introduce negative mass. Let's say that m2 is the negative mass present in a Lutece field. Then we get a negative gravitational force. That means that the Earth is repelling the negative mass in the Lutece field. Now, if you balance out the attractive force between Columbia and Earth with the repelling force between Earth and the negative mass present in the Lutece field, you get a city that
simply failed to fall.